quick video on lighting your natural scenes in Unreal Engine 5. I will note that lighting in Unreal is a huge topic, and there are plenty of resources out there on all sorts of different lighting setups for different lighting environments. What we are going to be focusing on in this video and in this course is outdoor real-time lighting. So we're going to be focusing on scenes which are lit with just the sun and the sky and as your main light sources, and we're not going to be going into things like indoor lighting scenes, which can sometimes use very different techniques. If you're interested in that sort of thing, there are plenty of resources out there. Search for indoor lighting or interior lighting. But for this video, we're going to focus specifically on outdoor lighting, so bear that in mind as we go forward. Without further ado, let's hop over into Unreal and get started. All right, here we are in the scene that I've been building up over the past couple of videos, including the optional water from the previous video, as well as the foliage and the materials that we've been painting on. Before we hop into lighting, there are three things that I want to talk about very quickly to help us get set up in the best possible way. The first is being able to see the game view as is without anything in the way. The second is to do with scalability settings, so making sure that we don't fry our computers while we edit. And then the third is to do with making sure that we have a consistent brightness throughout the scene, so that when we edit the lights, we know what we're looking at is accurate. Let's start with the first, because that is the most simple. So because we've been adding a lot of stuff to our scene, we have a couple of these widgets in the way, or these gizmos, whatever you want to call them, just 2D icons which give you a sense of something in the scene, but they're not actually part of your world. They're just part of editing your world. For instance, this river thing over here, and I think there's one for the lights as well somewhere. Sometimes they're useful to be able to click on something and edit that immediately, but sometimes we just want them gone away. There's a very easy way to do that. You press G on your keyboard, and all of your 2D sort of icons and UI disappears, and you see what you will see in the final product, the final output of your game or your movie or whatever you're making. So this is a quick way to just see what the whole scene looks like. Press G and then press G again to bring those back. Alright, so the second piece of setup is to do with scalability. You may or may not have in the top left-hand corner of your viewport an option to set scalability. By default, mine was set to cinematic, and this may be the case for you. And what I've noticed is as I've painted on a bunch of stuff into the scene, my editor's feeling a little bit slow and sluggish, and especially if you have an older computer or you're working on a laptop or something, you might find that the engine really starts to freeze up on you as you create these big, large scenes. This may not be an issue for you, you may be able to work that way, but what you can do if you want a little bit more of a responsive editor is reduce the scalability settings to something a little bit lower. If you don't see this drop-down scalability menu in the top of your viewport, just hop over into the top right-hand side of the screen, under Settings, Engine Scalability Settings, and then you've got this quality bar over here. This settings menu adjusts the quality of your viewport, not your final output. So if you're creating a movie, this isn't going to affect the quality of your final movie. If you're creating a game, this isn't going to affect the quality of your final game. This will just allow you to use the viewport a little bit more snappily. Do note that this means that what you're seeing in the viewport is not going to 100% correspond to your final thing. For instance, if you look at my grass over here, it's doing some weird thing where it's kind of popping out and not really rendering properly. So whenever you want to get a real sense of what your scene properly looks like, do pop back into cinematic, because that will show you the final view of your scene. But just for working in the editor, I usually go to something like high or even medium if it's a really, really heavy scene. Let's put it on high for now and leave it there. Great, so the final piece of setup that I want to do is to make sure that we have a consistent brightness. You may have noticed that occasionally the camera brightens up and darkens down in response to how bright the scene is. So for instance, if I look right at the sun, where's the sun in my scene? If I look right at the sun, then this area kind of darkens down so that I can see the sun as like a round disk. And then if I move the camera towards a dark shadowy area, first it starts off dark and then it brightens up, because the camera is trying to be smart and it's trying to show us as much as it can of that scene. This process is called auto exposure metering. It's built in by default to the engine. And it's great if you have a game where you're traveling from a cave to an outside scene, because it's automatically adjusting the brightness based on the scene around you. But for us, while we're building the level, we don't exactly want that. Because if I bring in a new light and make that light really, really bright, the scene's going to automatically compensate for that, even though my scene might actually be way overexposed. So, while we are designing our lights, we want to turn off the auto exposure metering mode, even if we want to bring it back later on. To do that, we're going to use something called a post-process volume. In your Place Actors panel, search for Post, and the only option that should come up is Post-Process Volume, and drag that into the scene. Post-processing is a collection of effects that is applied after the frame is rendered. It's basically a filter that's applied per frame. This way you can change the color of your scene, you can add certain full screen effects like blurs and sharpenings, and pertinent to this video, you can brighten or darken the entire image. And that's what this auto exposure metering is doing. It's brightening the final image after everything is rendered. We need to override that default behavior by adding our own post-process volume, and then in the details panel, searching for unbound. And an option will come up that says infinite extent unbound. Just make sure that is checked, and in short what this is doing is making sure that this post-processing that we're going to create in just a second is applied to all cameras everywhere in the scene. Sometimes you don't want the post-processing happening everywhere. For instance, if you're creating an effect for just underwater, you'll then put this box just under the water. But for us, we want it to apply all over, so we keep the infinite extent unbound checked. The next thing that we're going to do is search for exposure. And in the details panel, we should have a drop-down menu that has a lot of different exposure settings. We're going to ignore most of them, except for minimum brightness and maximum brightness. So check min brightness and check max brightness, and just set those both to 1. And in my case, my scene immediately darkened down. You might have your scene brighten up or darken down, or nothing at all happen. And that just tells me that my scene was automatically brightening itself up quite a lot. And I can see why, because there's a lot of dark, shadowy areas in my scene. So just to go over those steps again, add in your Place Actors panel, add a post-process volume, drag that into your scene, click on the post-process volume, search for unbound, make sure infinite extent unbound is checked, and then search for exposure and make sure the min and max brightness are set to 1. Now that we've done those 3 things, we should be able to start setting up the lights for our scene in a consistent and reliable way. So let's get started. If you have been following this course from the beginning, you might already have in your outliner a lighting folder, and within that lighting folder there are 3 things: sky, atmosphere, skylight, and sunlight. If you don't, no drama, just go to Window, Environment Light Mixer, and then add the sunlight, the skylight, and the sky atmosphere. Sunlight might not be called skylight, it might be called atmospheric light 0. So once you've got those 3 lights in, these are basically the 3 lights that we are going to be using to light our scene. These are essentially the 3 actors which we are going to be using to light our scene. Because we are focusing on outdoor natural environments, we're only really going to be focusing on the sunlight as the source of light for our scene. If you wanted to add other lights in your scene, for example to simulate a campfire or something like that, you are totally welcome to do that, and all you need to do is in your Place Actors panel, search for light, find the point light option, which is down over here, and then drag that into your scene, and you'll be able to add different types of lights this way. I'm not going to focus too much on that. You're more than welcome to try, but that's not going to be the focus of this video. This video is going to focus on these 3 lights, or these 3 actors: the sky atmosphere, the skylight, and the sunlight. Let's start with the sunlight, because that is ostensibly the most important. I'm going to click on the sunlight, press F, and there is my sunlight. It's currently at 000, but where it is in the scene doesn't really matter. Because this is essentially a light that is infinitely far away and pointing in just a direction, I can put this anywhere in my scene and it will have exactly the same effect. The thing that will change the way that the sun interacts with the scene is the rotation. So The only reason that I keep it at 0, 0, 0 is by convention. You are more than welcome to put your light wherever it's going to make sense for you to be able to grab it in the scene. The position doesn't matter so much, but what does matter is the rotation. I'm going to press E to bring up my rotation tool and start rotating my sunlight. I think what I'll do is put the axis mode into global so that I can drag the blue axis around, and that's going to be rotating the sun around my scene. Similarly, I can then use the red to drag the sun laterally and change its position on the horizon. And unsurprisingly, as I lower the sun, the scene gets a little bit darker and the shadows get longer. So that's basically simulating the time of day. I have some really nice shadows going on, which I will talk about in just a second. But otherwise, everything is acting pretty much as I would anticipate. What's really nice is that the sun is directly connected to this sky atmosphere, which if I turn that off, it's basically rendering the sky. So as I move my sun towards the horizon, let's just move it around to this side and then push it down towards the horizon. You can see that the sky atmosphere is creating a nice, really beautiful sky gradient based on the position of the sun. So that all works really nicely together. The one thing that's a little bit frustrating about this, though, is that right now I'm using this gizmo to move the sun around. And doing that might be a little bit tedious, especially if my camera is all the way over here and I'm maybe playing around with this rock, and then I want to see how the sunlight looks on different angles. Then I would have to move away from the rock, go back to where the sun lives, go back to my rotate tool, and then start moving it around. Start moving the sun around again. And that's all a little bit tedious. And the developers of Unreal know this, so there is a shortcut to move the sunlight around the scene. And that shortcut is Control and L. So if you press Control and L on your screen, you'll get this gizmo, which shows you the direction of the sun as that sort of teal blue arrow. And if you hold Control L and move your mouse around, you begin to move the sun around this gizmo, and it's updating the sun's position in real time. This does take a little bit of time to get used to, so I encourage you to get comfortable with it before you move on. But in short, if you move the mouse from side to side, you are rotating the sun around the z-axis. And then if you move the mouse up and down, you are changing the sun's lateral position in the sky. So this is a really quick way to reposition the sun. Let me just point at the horizon a bit more. Reposition the sun further higher in the sky, lower in the sky, or laterally along the horizon. So that's really going to be the main tool that you use when positioning the light in your scene. Control L and then move the sun around to where you want it to be. This means that you can be looking at a specific asset like this rock and seeing how the different light angles affect that, or you could be looking at an entire view and see Control L how the sun responds to that view. I find this super handy, but if it doesn't work for you, you can always go back to the rotate tool and use that instead. Really, just use whatever works for you. Now that we've got a sense of how to move the sun around, let's talk a little bit about some of the other settings. So with your sun selected in the details panel, there is a light tab. And if you click that tab or drop down menu, whatever you want to call it, there are some options to play around with. The first is source angle. And if you look at the shadows of the sun, this source angle is going to determine the hardness of these shadows. So at an angle of 0, the shadows are very sharp. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a sort of really hard line between the shadow and the light. But if you increase that angle, you get slightly blurrier shadows. The default, I believe, is the physical size of our sun disk in the sky. So this is how shadows would appear in real life. But if you want something a bit more crisp, you can set that lower. If you want shadows a little bit more blurry, set that higher. Source soft angle. This isn't actually going to have any effect on our scene. This is more to do with a light baking setting, and we're not going to be baking our lights, so this isn't something we have to worry about. If we activate use temperature, then the temperature slider is open to us. And this gives us the option to make the sunlight a little bit more sort of yellowy and warmer on the very far extent of that scale, or a lot more blue on the high end of that scale. So if you understand what light temperature means, then you're more than welcome to use this. Otherwise, don't worry about it, because the other way you can affect the light's color is right at the bottom where it says light color. If you click on that, you get a color wheel, which allows you to tint the light to any color that you want. Obviously, if you're going for something natural looking, then this slider might not be, then this color wheel might not be what you use, because you can get some really trippy colors here. But if you're going for an alien world or something very stylized, then this could totally be useful to you. Effects World gives you the option to turn your light off for your world. I'm not 100% sure why you would want to do that, but it's there if you want to. And then Cast Shadows lets you turn off the shadows of this light. I usually keep my main sunlight shadows on. There are a few reasons why you might not want shadows in your world, but for our purposes, probably you'll just want to keep your shadows on for the most part. Indirect light intensity. This is the intensity of the light that is bounced away from other objects. So it's a little bit of a subtle effect most of the time, but if you look at this area of the rock over here, if I set my indirect light intensity to 0, then this rock, this sort of unlit side of the rock is pretty dark. But if I set that up to 6, you'll see that the light starts bouncing off all these objects around the rock back into the rock. So this is a way to give a little bit more bounced light throughout the scene. Generally, it's pretty safe to leave that as the default, which is 1. And then volumetric scattering intensity, we won't worry about this right now. We'll cover volumetrics in a later video. This is a way to give this light a little bit more punch through things like clouds or fog or other volumetric effects. And then lastly, perhaps the most important setting on this tab is the intensity. This is simply the way that you can brighten up or darken down your light. 10 is generally a really good starting point, but depending on your scene and what you're doing, you may want to mess with that slider as well. That's it for the sunlight for now, so let's move on to the other type of light in our scene, which is the skylight. The sunlight is the main single directional light which is coming from the direction of the sun and lighting all of our objects on one side and casting shadows on the other side. The skylight, on the other hand, is a general, what's called an ambient light. So this is light which comes from all over and bounces around the scene with no particular direction. It is essentially trying to emulate the light that would be coming from the general sky. So it's going to appear as if the light is coming from all different directions with no particular directionality to it. To get a little bit more of a sense of what this skylight is doing, we can click the little eye on the sunlight to turn the sunlight off, and everything that remains in the scene at this point is lit from the skylight. So the skylight is this general ambient green, very subtle, very faint color that's being cast throughout the scene. This light is just sort of generally lighting everything in the scene with a very small amount of brightness. If I turn this off now, then the scene is completely unlit and totally dark. One question that you might have is, currently there is no sky, because the sky atmosphere, that the blue sky that you see is connected to the sunlight. So when there's no sun, there's no sky either, right? So if we turn off the sunlight, we're basically saying that there's no light scattering around in the atmosphere. So why then is this skylight still casting light in our scene? The reason for that is that this skylight does not automatically update. We have to either force it to automatically update or manually update it ourselves. So if I, with the skylight selected, if I scroll all the way to the bottom of the details panel, there is a drop-down option called Recapture Scene. And if I hit Recapture with the sunlight off, now the skylight has updated and said, okay, so there's no sky, therefore I'm not going to be casting any light. If I bring the sunlight back, Now you can see that there isn't any ambient light cast. All these shadows are pure black. But if I recapture the sunlight, the skylight again, then that ambient light comes back in. So this recapture is really good to do every once in a while, especially if you start moving around your main light. So let's say I put my sunlight on the horizon over there for some sort of sunset vibe. Now this ambient light is no longer correct in my scene because it was captured when the sun was high in the sky. So it's very bright, it's almost bluish. So I'm going to hit recapture now, and that darkens down my scene to a more appropriate level. If this is too dark for you, you can go to the skylight settings and increase the intensity a little bit. Oh, that's way too much. And then you've got a general ambient color in your scene. So you can use this intensity slider to increase the intensity without actually changing the colors. And you can tint your skylight. So for instance, if I wanted a strange reddish hue to my world, this is where I might be able to do that. The other option that you have, let's just reset that to what it was before. If you don't like the idea of coming into the skylight and hitting recapture every time you change your main light around, or if your game involves updating the main light, so if you have a blueprint script on your light which moves it across the sky over time, what you can do is in the top of the skylight settings, check real-time capture. And this is going to forcibly update your skylight every couple of frames. So if I move the sunlight now to the horizon, the skylight is updating automatically. And if I turn the sunlight off, then the skylight turns itself off automatically. Be careful about this though, because the reason that the skylight is not automatically doing this is because this real-time capture is quite computationally expensive. And if you're trying to run on a laptop or an older PC, or especially if you're trying to run a mobile game, real-time capture is really going to slow up your game. So you're going to start getting stuttering and lagging. So I would say unless you have a really important reason to keep real-time capture on, leave it off by default, and every once in a while just come to the skylight and hit recapture after you move your main light around. That should give you a general introduction to using the skylight and the sunlight together. But as you can see, there are a ton of other settings which you can go through. The documentation is all on Epic's website, so if you are curious about getting some really interesting behavior out of these lights, I encourage you to check the docs yourself, or just click through some of these settings and play around with them in your scene. Like most other settings in Unreal, if you move something around and you don't like it or it breaks your scene, you can always hit the reset property button in the far right to undo any changes that you've made. Alright, so then the last piece of this puzzle is the sky atmosphere. Sky atmosphere, as I've alluded to before, is connected to the sun in that wherever the sun is, the sky atmosphere is going to draw that sun and then try to construct the sky as if that sun was scattering light throughout the sky. So without the sunlight, you're not going to get any sky. And then also, without the sky atmosphere, you're not going to get any sky. There's a subtle difference though. If you turn the sunlight off, your whole scene goes dark. But if you turn the sky atmosphere off, the sunlight is still casting light, so the sun still exists in the scene. It's just as if you're on an atmosphereless planet. So this would be great if you needed the moon, for example. But because we're on Earth, we're going to enable the sky atmosphere and talk a little bit more about what we can do with it. There are sort of two ways to generally adjust the look of the sky atmosphere, if you want to. You don't have to, because this is a really good physically accurate sky with some really beautiful gradients to it. But if you did want something a little bit more custom, there are a couple of different things that you have access to. The first is a set of sort of physically accurate settings where we can change the parameters of the simulation of actual light moving through the atmosphere. And that is in the sky atmosphere details panel, with all of these different, from planet down to atmosphere absorption. So the planet gives us the radius of the planet we're on, and often this doesn't have a massively noticeable effect, but you can see that This mostly changes the way that the horizon gradient fades into the top of the sky. The default is the radius of the Earth. The ground albedo is the reflected light from the ground. So with a neutral gray, it means that you're not getting any additional color contribution to the sky. But if we had something like red, then you'll notice that there's a slight tint of red towards the horizon. I will set that back to default. I won't go over all these settings now, though. There is atmosphere, Rayleigh scattering, Mie scattering, and absorption. These are all settings which try to reflect the way that actual light interacts with the atmosphere, and adjusting these settings will give you some really interesting results. Although, unless you have a sense of what each of these settings is actually doing, you can get some pretty crazy looks pretty fast. So it can be a little bit confusing at times to start moving these sliders around to try and get a specific look, which brings me to the second way that we can change the look of the sky, and that is the Art Direction tab. So under all of these physically accurate settings, which have sometimes almost meaningless effects on the actual look of the scene, underneath all of those settings, there is the Art Direction scene where you can click on the Sky Luminance Factor and simply change the color of your sky, which is perhaps what you would be going for ultimately anyway. So if you just want to create a green sky or a blue sky or a red sky, I would suggest going to the Art Direction tab and then using the color wheel there to change the color of your sky. If you have a very, very specific desire and you have the time to do the research into what Mie scattering and Rayleigh scattering is, more power to you. You're totally welcome to do that. But I find that the Art Direction tab is a lot simpler to work with for most purposes. I wouldn't worry about any of the other settings on the Art Direction tab. Those are all things that we will deal with later on in the course. Alright, now that we've got a sense of what these three main light actors do, let's talk a little bit about some of the extra tools that we can use to really bring our scene together. The first is shadows. In previous versions of this class, shadows was quite a huge topic because there were a lot of different ways that you had to set up your shadows to work. But in Unreal Engine 5, there is a new and still experimental setting called Virtual Shadow Maps. So if you type Virtual Shadow, you should get in your engine rendering tab a Shadow Map Method option, Shadow Map Method, and this should be on Virtual Shadow Maps Beta. If this is on Shadow Maps, which it may be if you migrated a project from a previous version of Unreal, then your shadows might be a little bit messed up. As you can see here, I've got shadows which disappear, shadows which are in certain places and not in other places. And that's because the old method of shadow maps was very complex and had lots of different moving parts, which has entirely been revamped with virtual shadow maps. So if you set virtual shadow maps, then basically the shadows in your scene should be good to go from the outset, which is really cool and makes my job very easy. This is a relatively new feature though, so if you do have trouble with the virtual shadow maps, then feel free to try set your setting back to normal shadow maps. And there are plenty of resources out there on how to use old UE4 shadow maps if you require them. But hopefully virtual shadow maps should be good for you, and you should get all these beautiful shadows in your scene without too much of an issue. The only other concern that you might have with shadows then is sometimes your shadows might be too dark or too bright, and you might have the question of how do I brighten up this shadowy area? And generally, if your shadow is too dark, that has something to do with the skylight. So that's this ambient light that we spoke about at the beginning of this video. So first of all, make sure that you've gone into your skylight and recaptured your scene. And already that's a little bit better. My shadows are a little bit less dark. And then if it's still too dark, you might want to go in and increase the intensity. Oh, that's way too high. Maybe something like 2 or 3 would do it for me, because now I have a sense of there are shadowy areas in my scene, but they're still relatively bright as if lit from the sky above. That is entirely up to you though. Your scene might want some really dark shadowy areas for a sinister mood or something like that. So the brightness of your shadows is purely an art direction thing at this point. And up to you and how you want to light your scene. Then the last little feature that I want to talk about in terms of lighting is in the sunlight. If you search for light shaft, you'll get the option to enable light shaft occlusion and light shaft bloom. And what this is going to do is give you if you look at the sun now with an occluding object in front of it, it'll give you these light rays, which really help sell the scene and bring it together and give it a sense of atmosphere. By simply checking light shaft occlusion and light shaft bloom, you've already added a lot of potential atmosphere to your scene. So let's go over here and move the light down towards the horizon, and we've got a pretty atmospheric scene already with these light rays that emerge from the sun behind certain objects, and that can look really good behind trees and things like that. This default effect might be a little bit much. In my case, it's a little heavy-handed, so I could either use the light shaft setting to reduce the scale, which is going to reduce the length of the light shafts. So if I set that to 0.01 or something, then it'll still be really bright, but the shafts won't extend out as far. Or if I set that back to what it was before, probably more usefully, reducing the max brightness. So this is going to keep your light shafts long, shooting across the screen, but it will reduce the intensity of them a little bit to something a little bit less heavy-handed and more subtle. As with most of this lighting video, what you end up doing will entirely depend on what you're going for in your scene. And then the last thing that you can do is, by default, the color of the bloom will depend on the light. So right now it's a nice orange bloom because the sun is deep in the sky. But if I set this further up in the sky, then you can see that the light shafts are reflecting the color of the sun at that point. But you can go to the bloom tint and set them to any color that you want. In short, the default is probably a little bit heavy-handed, but with a little bit of tweaking, you can get a nice subtle effect that, even if not super noticeable, does add a little bit of extra flair to the scene and just helps sell that there is an atmosphere in your scene. Okay, I think that's it from me for now. With these 3 actors and the settings that I've shown you today, you should be able to get started lighting your scenes in a variety of different ways. As with most things in Unreal, there are very vast rabbit holes that you can dive down in terms of all of the different settings for these components, but what we've covered today should get you most of the way towards whatever vision you have. So I encourage you now to jump into your own scenes and begin exploring the different lights that you can add to your worlds. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please post them to the class discussion board. Otherwise, I will catch you in the next video. Cheers.